عفوا. Can you hear me?
Yes. So I'm just here to welcome Professor Sébastien Marot. We are very happy to have you with us. Professor Marot is here for the first time in this city, so it's the first time he's invited at the Polytechnico di Torino. We've been the first. We're very happy to have done this. Professor Marot doesn't really need presentations, but let me just remind a few things. He's currently professor at the School of Architecture of the Université Paris-Est in Paris, and a visiting professor at the EPFL in Lausanne. He's been teaching in a number of French, European, and North American institutions, possibly too many to number. The Graduate School of Design at Harvard, the ETH in Zurich, etc., etc. I really cannot remember. Professor Marot has been a protagonist of the European debate on architecture since, at the very least, the late 1990s. You've been very active in the architectural press, especially through a number of French magazines. The magazine Le Visiteur, which was published, I guess, by the Société Française des Architectes, exactly, starting from the mid-1990s, which is sort of created and run for some time, which was a reference point for European debates on architecture. And then other journals, the journals of the Marne-la-Vallée School of Architecture at some point, if I remember. So, and it was a moment of large sharing and translations in European culture. And among the places in which you have taught, there is the Architectural Association in London, from where you, which published, I guess, your first book in English, which is Suburbanism and the Art of Memory, right? In the early 2000s. I forgot to mention that you're a philosopher and a historian by training, although your field of specialization is actually architectural history and theory. Professor Marot has published a number of books, of which this book on suburbanism and the art of memory is possibly the first important one. You may also remember the work he did for the republication, the critical edition of Rem Koolhaas and Oswald Matthias Unger's manifesto on Berlin, City Within the City, the Green Archipelago. We have invited you here. He's here to discuss his possibly last major publication and exhibition project, which is called Taking the Countryside. It's about the agriculture and architecture in history and in future perspective. It's a project that resulted in an exhibition for the Lisbon Triennale, I guess, in 2019. And the exhibition has become a traveling exhibition, which has now been in a number of places. The last one was in Marseille. Professor Marot is currently teaching, among other things, environmental history at the EPFL as a visiting professor, which resonates very well with the environmental history of architecture courses that we are holding here at master and PhD level. So it looked like a very good idea to trade a few ideas about how environmental histories interfere with architectural history and theories these days. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Is it too loud? Is it okay? First, thank you very much. As you said, it's my first time in Torino, and it's a fantastic opportunity for me to be welcome in the Lingotto. A very, very amazing reference for all of us. So, as you said, it's been now 20 years somehow that that doesn't work. Doesn't work anymore. All right. So it's been now almost 20 years that my focus in teaching in schools of architecture has been to the history of the environment. I came back from the States in 2006, where I had spent some years thinking that it was absolutely fundamental to teach the history of the environment in schools of architecture and landscape architecture, given the fact that, in my view, these big concerns are of such a nature that they should change the way we design, basically. So a few years ago, for 10 years, between 2010 and 2019, let's say, I was teaching in the different institution that you mentioned, but I was teaching to the students, the Harvard students involved at OMA in Rotterdam in helping REM investigating, REM Koolhaas investigating a number of subjects that led to exhibitions such as the Venice Biennale in 2014 on the elements of architecture. And so slowly, although my job was not to directly be involved in this exhibition, I, of course, kind of oriented my subjects so that they may help the students in their investigations. And for instance, in 2014, I devoted some time to one of the elements of architecture that interested me, particularly because of my interest in environmental concerns and resource concerns, energy. And so I devoted an essay to the fireplace within these things. Then Rem decided that he wanted to do a big exhibition on a new subject, which was the countryside. And so for some years, the students were involved in investigated that subject. And the Rem's pitch on that was, if you remember, that architects has usually been concentrated, focused on cities and metropolises, including him. And maybe nowadays, what is changing really, really fast is not cities, but rather the rest, the countryside. And I was very interested by this subject because since the time I started history of the environment in different schools of architecture, that led me to devote particular attention to another field of activities aside architecture, which we call agriculture. With the following pitch, basically, agriculture and architecture are twin sisters, meaning that they emerge in our histories around the same time, can be different times or periods according to the different subcontinents where agriculture started to emerge in what we call the Neolithic period. But basically, what happened at that time is that humans, societies, started to, on the one hand, domesticate plants and animals, meaning energy converters, and in so doing, started to domesticate themselves on a given territory within more and more permanent structure or infrastructure, which we call architecture. So basically, architecture and agriculture are taken in a kind of autocatalytic process of sedentarization, right? And are both of them domestication processes. On the one hand, domestication of plants and animals. On the other hand, domestication of humans within permanent territories, see, with which they start to co-evolve. So I was interested to participate into that new exhibition project developed by REM, but soon, very soon, which led to an exhibition that took place at the Guggenheim in New York, which, as you know, looks a bit like the ramp here in the Lingotto. Unfortunately, this exhibition was a bit delayed and opened in February 2020. So like after a week, it was closed. But in the meantime, I thought that this subject of the countryside was very important, and I had different views on that subject than Rem's team. And I thought that instead of just like pointing at issues that were really evolving rapidly, which was basically the subject of Rem's exhibition, I thought it was important, or it should be important, to look back in history to other designers that, as I said, took the countryside, considered the countryside as a genuine territory of design, different from cities and metropolises, because Rem was not the first to actually be interested in the countryside. So I quit, in a way, before a year before, and took the opportunity of the Lisbon Triennale to do another exhibition on the same subject. In a way, I described my exhibition as a kind of transatlantic footnote to his, that took place in Lisbon in time, meaning in September 2019, so that the footnote came before the big one. And we were lucky, since the exhibition could be seen in Lisbon. Okay. So I often use that image from Joel Sternfeld, the photographer, that goes back to 1976. Which I love, really, because it kind of shows the respective situations of architecture and agriculture nowadays. I remember that during the Kyoto summit at the end of the 90s, our president, Jacques Chirac, said, "The house is burning and we are looking elsewhere." So you see the house is burning, architecture is burning, and you see the firemen's like busy kind of during Halloween, probably getting some pumpkins. They are in a kind of farmer's market that is in a state of a horrible state, in a way. So the respective situations of agriculture and architecture are quite well shown here. So we didn't have the Guggenheim, of course. We were in Lisbon, in the Centro Cultural do Belém. In a kind of parking lot that has been transformed into a place where you do exhibitions in architecture there. But a parking lot is a kind of nice exhibition space, with two central rows of columns like that. Looks a bit like the plan of a basilica, and so we used it like that, So that was the plan of the exhibition. You see in the center the nave, made of 6, now it's 7, series of 7 panels, each organized chronologically and thematically. The first one was called Agriculture and Architecture. The second one was called Agriculture and Urbanism. The third one, we called it From Agronomy to Agroecology, to try to explain a bit the evolution of the knowledge, of agricultural knowledges during the millennia. The fourth one was called Exit Urbs, meaning it was a kind of very short synthetic history of what you may call the back to the land movements. You probably all know that there was a kind of back to the land movement in Europe and in the United States in the 70s, with hippies leaving the consumer society and setting, going into the desert with domes by Buckminster Fuller or stuff like that. But if you look more carefully in history, there are many periods that could be described as vast back to the land movements, right? You might say that what we call the medieval period, at least half of it, meaning 5 centuries, after the erosion of the Roman Empire, could be described as a back to the land movement leading to new societal development, feudal stuff, customs, etc. So we wanted to look into that with the hypothesis, the following hypothesis: maybe metropolises and cities, which are considered by architects usually as their ecological niche, maybe they are not the manifest destiny of humankind. And we might very well, who knows, be at the eve of a kind of new medieval period because of the consequences of environmental issues. I'll go back to that. So that was the nave, leading to the choir up, where we devised with a friend, architect and illustrator, a kind of compass or windrose, trying to show the different direction that the relationship between agriculture and architecture, between cities and countryside, might take in the near future, right? Inviting visitors to, in a way, locate themselves into this, because you always hear about urban agriculture, a kind of oxymoron that. But when you listen carefully to what is promoted through that catching phrase, you can distinguish, I think, many, many different narratives that are sometimes completely opposed to one another. So the goal of that windrose was to try to clarify a certain number of distinctions when we hear about urban agriculture. And finally, on this side here, is that it? Yeah, that was a gigantic illustrated timeline, 60-meter long there, where all these different events that we documented in the nave were located in a kind of continuous history from the Paleolithic to today, right? And on the other side, there were different chapels where we showed documentaries, interviews that we did with activists or other people today on this subject of the relationship of agriculture and architecture. Okay. So I show you the exhibition in Lisbon here in that huge garage. On the back, you could compare these panels to a kind of a deck of cards, as when you play a patience, you play alone, and you put your cards and you wonder where you should put them. And it's a very, very nice game to do, to pass time. On the back of the cards usually are mute, if only to hide the value of the card. We use those back in the exhibition to show images that are usually much well known, especially by architects, hoping that by their placement, their resonance with the panels that are in front or in back, they would get a new meaning in some ways. Also because it's a very stuffy exhibition, right? And when people had gone all the way to the choir, when they had to get back, I mean, they couldn't read more. So it was more like a constellation of pitch black images that they had to deal with. Okay. This was in Lausanne, same process. This was in Lyon, in the wonderful orangerie of the Parc de la Tête d'Or, where we devised another scenography for that. It was in Brussels, in a kind of central market in the city. And this was very recently in Marseille, where the exhibition closed a couple of weeks ago. So this is the timeline that I show very briefly here. So as I said, I'm not going to delve into this because it's huge. It's basically my teaching on the history of the environment on the wall. You know, it's very useful for my students. Now they have a kind of a resume, synopsis, you know. I'm interested in the art of memory, how to teach. I think this is a very good way to teach through images, right? So this timeline, as you see, is made of drawings, these different periods, with quotes from archaeologists, anthropologists, historians that have, in our view, explored in a very interesting way those different periods. So we have these famous Neolithic revolutions that sees agriculture and architecture emerge. The urban revolution that ensued usually 2 to 3 millennia after the cradles of agriculture, and giving way to, you know, very, very complex societies or city-state with a social hierarchy, high division of labor, usually slaves also a lot, etc. The first empires, which also were made possible by revolutions in the way plants were cultivated and animals were domesticated. This hugely interesting period of the medieval period that I was describing as a kind of back to the land movement of de-urbanization in some ways, which led to feudal organization, to commons, to customs, local customs, to a whole vernacular process that is today very interesting to go back to and to interpret. And one of the fields in history which is the most creative at the moment is medieval history. Looking back at that whole period that was always taken as a kind of foil to the progress that came after, right? Now it's a bit changing this view. The rise of market economy slowly with the incredibly important phenomenon that took place at that time between the 16th and the 19th century, early 19th century, which is the phenomenon of the enclosure, the dismantling precisely of all the vernacular customs, local, not urban, that had taken place during the medieval period, and that we are badly interested now into illuminating again. And then, of course, the Industrial Revolution that took place, or let's say the industrial revolutions that succeeded after, that you could, in a way, distinguish by the major fossil energy that they tapped into, first coal, then gas and oil, and then the mastery of that secondary form of energy, which is electricity, and all their huge consequences on the organization of society and territories, their geographical consequences, you might say, up to consumer society today. To the great, what has been called the great acceleration in the consumption of all resources during the second half of the 20th century up to today, leading to a situation which we summed up in that almost last segment of this timeline in the following manner. Here you see in the center of that image, you see a huge phenomena that has accompanied the whole Industrial Revolution, which is the urbanization of the world, right? You all know that, you know, the UN statistics tell you that in 2008, we became 50% on the planet to be urbanites, and that in 2050, the idea is that might be 70%. So you can see that the Industrial Revolution accelerated what was called the rural exodus, the flocking of people, also because of the enclosures, into cities or metropolises. So that's one major phenomenon which we put at the center of this image. But it is surrounded, and on top of this phenomena, we have Rem Koolhaas here, which in my view has been the undisputed advocate of concentration of people into very dense cities. So it felt right to put him, you know, as the advocate of that phenomenon. But he's surrounded here by a series of other issues, which are environmental issues. Here, for instance, water scarcity now, soil erosion, degradation of the conditions of life on our planet, climate change, biodiversity collapse, pandemics that are caused by all these phenomena. And last but not least, progressive depletion of non-renewable resources, fossil energies, which I mentioned, but not only, also just material resources like metals, rare earth, everything that made the Industrial Revolution possible and made its acceleration possible. So this is our way to synthesize the situation nowadays. Okay. So this is just to illustrate, you know, how Rem Koolhaas, right from the beginning with his project Exodus, or the voluntary prisoners of architecture, in a way pointed to the final step of the rural exodus, right? People would become the voluntary prisoners, you know, of very dense structures, these monuments here. And it's not just the fact that he calls it Exodus has many meanings, but has this one also, you know, to say this is going to be the final radical step of the rural exodus. And you see today, you know, many people who are kind of inspired, like this project, The Line, in Saudi Arabia, also advocated as an environmental project, you know, to save humanity. And also in Italy, Stefano Boeri's project, I discovered that very recently in Paris Match, of this kind of new Maya city, 150,000 people right in the middle of the forest in Yucatan, you know. That's just amazing. That's people could do that today, but anyway, that's the thing. With this kind of huge oxymoron of an urban lung for the forest of Yucatan. Okay. Okay, concentration. And in a way, The City of the Captive Globe by Rem synthesized very well that idea of the, you know, condensation and concentration in metropolises, where you see New York, or the delirious New York and the delirious metropolis being, in a way, the matrix now of the world, you know, taking the place of Central Park in the city. Okay, so delirious New York was just that. a plea, an environmental plea, I'll come back to that, for concentration to save the world from collapse, in a way. Okay, of course, in the 70s, other people had other moods, ethos at the time, you know, and you see in this radical technology publication from Wales, you know, these young couple, you know, hesitating between different kinds of worlds that might take place. Okay, in a way, our goal in this exhibition was to help people go through a very paranoid situation, a schizophrenic or cognitive dissonance situation. Because if you are seriously informed about environmental issues today, then you're necessarily confronted to a very, very perplexing situation. On the one hand, when you look back at the past, at least the 2.5 last century, you cannot avoid the idea that urbanization, the urbanization of the world that has been continuously developing since, you know, is the manifest destiny of humankind, is inevitable and is integral to history. But at the same time, when you try to probe the future, I know it's not that easy, but to probe the future through the lens of those hugely concerning issues, environmental issues, you can't help feeling or thinking that this same global urbanization looks rather improbable, impossible, and like the end of history, which puts us in a very weird situation. How are we to deal with an evolution, ours, which look both inevitable and impossible? I'd like to help visitors or readers to, in a way, deal with that kind of oxymoric condition today. In front of these weird situations, there are, I think, two kinds of attitudes, two kinds of, way of dealing with these things. And it has been very well captured by Charles Mann in a book published 5 years ago, which I read while we were doing the exhibition, called The Wizard and the Prophet. In this book, Charles Mann does a kind of parallel biography of two very hugely important figures of the 20th century, which are not that well known, but were fundamental, which were two people involved with agriculture. The first one, which he calls the wizard, or which exemplifies what he calls the wizard, is Norman Borlaug, you know, up there. Norman Borlaug was this agronomist, American agronomist, which was the key figure of what has been called the Green Revolution. What is the Green Revolution? Happened like that. This guy and other agronomists went to Mexico with funds from the Rockefeller and the Ford foundations to accelerate the selection of cultivars, wheat, rice, corn, that would resist droughts, that would resist floods, that would put all their energy into the grain instead of the thing, you know, to help save humanity from hunger, right? So the Green Revolution was the exportation of those technical stuff that became later genetic engineering of plants to save the world. And actually, Norman Borlaug got the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1970 for having saved 1 billion people in the world. So the wizards are, for Charles Mann, the magicians. Those who, thanks to the genius of human disruption, technology, etc., can make the inevitable possible. That is the growth, you know, demographic growth possible, despite the apparent limit of our planet, right? These are the people who think that technology and the human genius can, in a way, overcome those limits, push them, right? The tech, basically. And then there are the prophets. The prophets here is exemplified in Charles Mann's book by William Vogt. William Vogt, who was an ornithologist, who was sent about the same time by the American government to inquire in the reason why the Chincha Islands had less guano than before, because guano was, the major natural fertilizers that all big countries, industrial countries, fought together against, to capture in some way. And then he published in 1947, if I remember well, a book called The Road to Survival, where he basically explained as a prophet that no, we should learn to live in good intelligence with the limits of the earth as is, because of course we can push them, of course we can overcome them for a time, but in doing this, it will only lead these limits reaffirming themselves more violently, And so the prophets are those who say, no, you cannot play with those limits. You can do it for a short time, but you aggravate the situation. Okay. In our exhibition, we clearly wanted to help the prophets against the wizards. Okay. This is a photo I took from my office at the EPFL. I had this sign, on the nanotechnology building just in front, which is really a wizard's motto, right? Saying we should inspire ourselves from nature to be better able to develop robots. In other words, our mission is to outsmart nature. Right, to replace nature, of course, by understanding it, but become more intelligent, smarter than she is. This is typical wizard thing. On the opposite, we are interested in many active prophets, such as in France, the Atelier Paysan, which for 15 years has been busy teaching new peasants or old peasants or farmers to conceive, develop, repair their own machines in order to reclaim the earth from those black boxes, which you get into debt for 30 years to buy, and that kind of dictates to you your mode of operation, right? These are prophets, or of course, one of the most insightful, I think, prophet of our time, David Holmgren, the co-founder of the permaculture movement, especially in this book, Permaculture Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, which is clearly one of the 2, 3, 4, 5 best books I've ever read in my life. And led me in a way to do this exhibition. So I'll have chosen a few panels. Of course, I can't show you all because it would take the whole day. But just a few. This one, A2, is my captatio benevolentiae for architects. Because all architects, in Europe, think that the Doric temple, there's no doubt that this is architecture. But what is a Doric temple? Why is a Doric temple as it is? As architects, you probably were taught, like by Vitruvius and others, that a temple, a Greek temple, is the transposition in stone of previous public buildings that used to be built in wood, hence the columns, hence the frieze here with the triglyphs that would be the end of beams, you know, symbolizing the end of beams of a kind of attic, etc., etc. In 1980, a German architect who is not especially an academic, had another hypothesis. He said, well, Greek temples, especially the Doric temple, they look very much like a very typical vernacular building that you could find in Europe everywhere, either in wood in Ukraine or in stone in Galicia or everywhere, which is a very functional vernacular building, which is the granary. The granary, like, you cannot imagine a more functional program, right? You need to get it out of the mud, hence, you know, pillars. Then you need to avoid pests, hence capitals, right? Either it works either by gravity, like in the Doric example, and in Switzerland you can see what they call Mausplatten that function exactly like that, so that the rats and other pests cannot, you know, go up. But it works also actually for the ionic thing. There are many places, I've seen some, where you put a linen with repulsive between the two. And acanthus in the Corinthian, you have to be strictly an architect to ignore that acanthus is a very well-known repulsive. Right? So, and then it's not all. Then there is another thing that you must achieve. It's ventilation, you know, in a granary. And so his hypothesis is that the triglyphs are not so much the symbols of the end of beam, but rather that of a ventilation system. Of course, you'll tell me, yeah, but a temple is not a granary. And that's exactly the point. Temples started to be erected in Greece around the 6th century BC, exactly at the time when Greek cities started to become dependent of regions around the Mediterranean for their basic needs in cereals, for example, developing military, navy, enslavement of whole regions to ensure that they would, and to concentrate their own agriculture on olive oil and wine, basically. But so it's not unusual that at the very moment you start to forget, in a way, practically, the values of the sustainable community, sovereign, you know, that represented, the granary represented, right? That at that very moment, you celebrate, you sublimate those values religiously, right? You know that the term sublimation means the moment when you transform something that used to be solid in something that becomes gaseous, right? There, okay. Okay, so for instance, at the back of this panel, of course, we showed, this is the kind of jokes we made. We showed this page from Vers une architecture of Le Corbusier. We could have taken Gropius celebrating the American grain silos as the model for modern architecture, you know, for functionalism there. So you see these kinds of resonance. Yeah, just Vitruvius, so the great treatise, you know, of architecture in this part of the world. Vitruvius very often quotes Varro, of whom he was contemporary with, and Varro was this very prolific writer who wrote like 100 volumes, but we only have one which is about complete, which is his treatises on agriculture, right? But he had also written about architecture and is quoted extensively by Vitruvius. This was a big authority, Varro. I will not dwell on this, but it's very interesting to know that one of the best copies that we have of Vitruvius' 10 books on architecture at the Biblioteca, I don't remember the name, but one of the best from the 14th century, is actually bound together with Varro's treatise on agriculture, and also Cato also's work on agriculture too, as if agriculture and architecture were the two sides of a same discipline, which is the management, of livable stuff. I think we should rebind together agriculture and architecture, and the whole goal of this exhibition is a kind of invitation to do this. Okay, I'll skip this because I have too many slides here. Maybe with the students tomorrow we can go back to some of them. Maybe this one in that first series is devoted to the Siedlungen. All architects have been taught about the wonderful architects of the Siedlungen, etc., but they were rarely explained. I think that one of a key mover in these things was a landscape architect called Lebrecht Migge. Lebrecht Migge has been forgotten in some ways, actively forgotten, because at the end of his life, this communist who was like became kind of sensitive to the Blut und Boden rhetoric of the Nazi. He died in 1935, but he started, so he has been completely, but he was very, very much involved in the Siedlungen to transform the Siedlungen into self-sufficient, with Adolf Loos, who did this little drawing up there. This was the Unité d'habitation, the productive garden and vegetable garden. The Siedlungen were a project of autosufficiency, there, that has, of course, been forgotten ever since. He was, Lebrecht Migge, the author of two manifestos in 1918. One was called Der Grün Manifesto. And in my knowledge, he was the first to associate the word green to the kind of ecological agenda. And another one, which was called Jedermann Selbstversorger, everyone autosufficient, which was the big goal at the moment, to escape, in a way, at least partly, the market system, and organize societies around self-sufficiency. This is the kinds of stuff. Second row of panels, I chose this one. As architect, you also have probably been explained, what were the rituals in the founding of Roman cities, like the Cardo and the Decumanus, like the pomerium, traced with a plow, driven by oxen around the designation of the area of the temple, which was an area before being a building. But there is another ritual which is less mentioned, but very important. Joseph Rigwert wrote a lot about it, which was the ritual of the mundus. The mundus was a kind of hole in the ground, a cavity, that was dug in the ground of the future city, where people that were to inhabit these cities, when it was a city of colonization, colons threw a handful of earth from their original patria, and then as a ritual of foundation was followed by rituals of refoundation every year. Each year it was product from their fields that they would throw into that kind of melting pot, So you have to understand that a Roman city was a plan defined by the Cardo and the Decumanus, but that there was a vertical axis, in a way, that linked it to its specific ground, and that went up into the sky. It was a volume, a virtual volume that was inhabited. So if you look at, when you know that, so that's a mundus in a Roman city. But if you start to activate paranoia, delirium, you look at the Piazza del Campo, in Siena. And, you know, that kind of shell in 9 parts, each separated by drains, you know, that convey the water at the foot of the Palazzo Civile there, with the Fontana di Gaia that was actually built in the 14th century together with the piazza. 9 segments, 9 fields of bricks, you know, symbolizing the 9 parts of the city, the 9 governors that are in the, etc. I can't help seeing that public space as a kind of mundus, a kind of public mundus, which is also like an emblematic model of the watershed that feeds the city of Siena, you see. It's a kind of operating mundus. If you look at Central Park in New York, you also have, like I said, a piece of idealized wilderness or landscape, you know, as if, you know, the metropolis had saved a kind of, symbol of the mundus there in the middle of the city. You have a kind of history of the globalization of the world, right? First, it's really local, and it becomes, you know, almost a kind of ID of the world. And Rem, in his City of the Captive Globe, when he puts the globe, you know, he substitutes the globe to Central Park, completely, in a way, finalize that story. Now, we only use the word world in the singular, not in the plural there. But that's a big question for us, you know. Can we really be citizens of the world if we are not the carers of a world, you know, here or there? Now, that's a big question to ask ourselves. Okay, so that you know, since we were in Siena, the imago mundi of the ideal relationship of the city and the countryside in Lorenzetti's famous fresco, which are in the building, or the reverse image just under showing the effects of the bag government. It was a very good idea that Bruno Latour had 20 years ago to gather one of the first meetings of environmental philosophy in the Sala dei Novi, in the Palazzo Civile, so that the speakers could have, you know, these memento under or in front of their eyes somewhere. Okay. Another one, Johann Heinrich von Thünen, a German physiocrat of the early 19th century, published a kind of book called The Isolated State in 1827, just before the Industrial Revolution started to have effects on the territory. In this book, he said, basically an agrarian society, these were agrarian societies at that time, tends naturally to, if it's run by physiocrats, farmers, intelligent farmers, will tend to be organized as that. In the center, a city to exchange stuff. And then a series of circles around where specific things would tend to, the closest to the city, things that require a lot of care, like horticulture, vegetable gardens, or which are perishable, like milk. So you would tend to have just near the city, so that they could also take advantage of the waste of the city there, you would tend to have these things. Then another circle, which at the time was very important because it was energy, wood. Wood is heavy, can't be too far, you know. So you need to have wood. And then a series of other circles, intensive agriculture, less intensive, and then finally, in a way, I sum it up very, very quickly, then animals, because animals are heavy, but they walk, you know. So you would have a kind, of course, no territory looks like that, because as soon as you have a river, there's an anamorphosis of all this, because the river is the main, way of transportation at the time. As soon as you have another city, it acts as a magnet that default. But basically because, of course, all lands are not equally fertile, and etc. But this being said, all things being equal, it would rather tend to be like that. Of course, a few decades after he formulated that very good theory, this exploded. This exploded because of coal, because of railways, where all of a sudden you would be able anyway to get very important things from afar, right? And where each locality started to specialize into its competitive advantage. If I have sun, I'll do tomato. If I have, everything. So, and our world is the product today of that specialization, made possible by rapid transportation, itself made possible by the Industrial Revolution, basically. Okay. If you now think about the word urbanism, when it started to appear, that word urbanism, let's say mid-19th century, urbanization with Cerda, etc. It starts, to designate a kind of discipline that deals with the management of cities. Okay. And then it really becomes a concept, I would say, in the early 20th century, where it's really theorized as a discipline there. When you are aware of that historical context, when the word appears, then you must say, I think, that urbanism doesn't designate so much the art of building cities than the art of managing the incredible growth of existing cities that happened due to the Industrial Revolution and to the rural exodus that it encouraged. So, if that is the case, then I would agree with Françoise Choët, the great French historian of urbanism, to distinguish a few different schools, but I would redefine those different schools. According to her, there was three basic schools of urbanism. One which she called progressism, one she called culturalism, and one that she called naturalism. Okay, progressism was, typically the moderns, the Charte d'Athènes, all these things. I would define progressism this way. I would say the progressists were those who, confronted to that huge extension of cities, thought that what should guide these extension was the program of the modern city, the program of the city. They said, well, such a big extension implies a change of quality, right? And so they inquired into what is this modern city in a way. And they took the model of the machine also to distinguish the main function of the modern city so as to have them work more efficiently as possible. The culturalists now were those who said, yeah, but hey, come on, the city is already existing. It has a DNA, it has a grammar, it has a whole, syntax of relationship between public and private, open and closed, etc. What should guide the extension of these cities is the DNA of the city itself, its cultural grammar, etc. And then you had the naturalists. If I remember well, Françoise Choët just showed one example, which is Frank Lloyd Wright, because of his broadacre city where everybody would become both a farmer and a citizen. And I would not put actually Frank Lloyd Wright in that category. I would rather put Frederick Law Olmsted, the co-author of Central Park, who designed in the 20th century, all these park system that were meant to guide, to become the spines of those extensions. And I would define naturalism as such, as those who think that what must inspire those extensions of cities are the actual territories on which these extensions are happening, their topography, their hydrography, you know, hence a Olmsted Park system with reservoir, with everything. That, you know. And I would add a fourth, in a way, school, which I would call regionalism. Regionalism, where generally naturalists and culturalists also, you know, but who thought that the naturalist point of view is so true that actually the city proper, the city itself, is not the only object of urbanism. That urbanism, which Patrick Guedes called geotechnics, has to embrace the whole watershed, the whole regions that feeds the city, and of which the city is only, let's say, a kind of central element or vital element. And that a very good illustration of this is this incredible drawing by Patrick Guedes and his team, you know, that superimpose a valley, a section through the valley, through the watershed, on top, you know, locating all the activities of which the people and the city depends: mining, forestry, agriculture, husbandry, vine, you know, everything up to fishing, you know, of which the city is a part that would be located somewhere here. And then the section of the city where everything corresponds, you know, the mining with the metals, etc., etc., etc. So that is the organism, the region, that is the real object of what Patrick Guedes called geotechnics, and which he defined as an geography applied to making the world more habitable. Okay. How much time do I have so that I... Wow. So that was the plantation and the enclosures in the other thing. That's the other phenomena in the transformation of agriculture. You could say the 19th century was the century when crafts were industrialized. And the 20th century was the century where all the rest was industrialized, including agriculture, which was in a way the last sector of the economy to be fully industrialized, but then big time. And there is an incredible thing, which is the industrialization of agriculture happened in Europe as a recycling of the industry of war. That's very stunning, you know. Already these two guys, Haber and Bosch, had devised just before the First World War an industrial system that would be able to capture, you know, the nitrogen in the air to make artificial fertilizer. But that was hugely energy expensive, too expensive for agriculture. But then the war happens, and it's about the same process to make explosives. So, of course, all the belligerents went into building this infrastructure, and after the war, they recycled them into producing fertilizers, you know. Tank became tractors, barbed wire were industrialized and transformed all the countrysides. You know, you name it. The same guys, they devised pesticides that were actually implemented during the war and experimented on humans before, you know, being the organochlorine gas, basically, before being applied to agriculture after the First World War. Then the Americans during the Second World War killed the rice paddies of Japan with DDT and things like that, and that became the herbicides stuff. I mean, it's amazing. It's also true in many other technology. You know, concrete would never have been developed on such a scale in architecture and urban if it had not been, you know. But in agriculture, it's amazing. And then after the Second World War, basically all governments, you know, urge farmers to adapt their practice to those new tools and technologies, basically. get big or get out. And this is how it accelerated immensely the rural exodus, you know, so that now we have like 1 or 2% of our population which is involved in farming nowadays. You know, with dreams like that, you know, of totally industrialized farms, of course, not run by peasants or farmers anymore, but by corporations, basically there. Of course, during that same time, other people had other views, right? Someone like Howard, the inventor, British inventor, you could say, of organic agriculture, was one of those guys sent by the Brits to India to teach those guys how to do agriculture. But then he goes to India and he sees the incredible science of composting there, etc. And he completely flips at that moment. And then says, but we should do that. We should do permanent agriculture that cultivates the soil, not just the plants, you know, etc. Well, and I don't have time to go into that, but and these guys coined the concept of permanent agriculture, an agriculture that would minimize entrance and extrance, you know, and would be more circular, would not go into the metabolical rift between cities and countryside that happened elsewhere. Okay, so this is the panels on the Back to the Land movement in the 70s, where I absolutely love, you know, the whole Earth catalog. That was the thing that was, you know, encouraged all new guys to flee the city. And they had that sentence, you know, which is exactly the reverse of the first sentence of the manifesto of the Communist Party by Marx and Engels. Workers of the world, disperse. And maybe the system will collapse if you just leave, you know, the thing, instead of uniting to fight him. Just abandon him, you know. Okay. Okay. So the 70s, 60s, 70s, that's our part on the environmental predicament. You have all these guys, you know, ringing bells about survival. You have this biologist and ecologist, Howard Odum, talking about energy descent, that we have to prepare very quickly an energy descent. That means, in his view, a de-urbanization, because for him, the concentration of cities is made possible by dense energies, basically. And so when these are going to lack, then you will have to quit cities. The limits to growth stuff, but you all know that, I guess. Well, you know, and it's in that decade that, that's interesting. When I read the first treatise of permaculture published in 1978 by David Holmgren and Bill Mollison, you can see that they have many references in the field of architecture, urbanism, Kevin Lynch, etc. Holmgren wanted to become a student of architecture. And it's only after a year of thinking that he said, no, I'd rather do something at the crossroad of agriculture, ecology, and landscape design. And in a way, permaculture came from that, you know. And he quotes in his, because the first book is basically his bachelor thesis, you know, he's 21, the guy. He quotes a guy named Colin Moorcraft. Have you, an architect, have you ever heard of this guy? Me neither. So I checked and I discovered a guy who was 25 in 1972, voracious reader of ecology and everything, even published a book on the degradation of seas and oceans at the time, and is the chief editor of an issue of architectural design called Designing for Survival. And fantastic essay he writes in this book, criticizing the green revolutions, the consequence of the green revolution, which is very early to do that, right? And finishing his text on a paragraph called Beyond Industrial Technology. And his last part of the essay, he explained we have to move to post-industrial technology, that is to system that would have three basic virtues. One is to be flexible, meaning conceivable, repairable, adaptable by their own users, not those black box that you buy from elsewhere. Second principle, they have to be integrated, minimizing entrance and extrance, being circular, being in recycling mode. And then final one, cooperative. And by this he meant system in which each element fulfills several functions and each function is fulfilled by several elements. Wow, that's amazing, because it's a functionalism, or you could say an alter functionalism, which is completely different from the functionalism of the modern, where each function was fulfilled by a very efficient element, and each element fulfilled very efficiently one function. Right? So the model was the machine. Here, the model is the ecosystem in which indeed, and that's the key of its resilience or homeostasis, each element fulfills several functions and everywhere. And you could say permaculture is the exact application of these three principles, first in the field of sustainable agriculture, at the community or the domestic level here. So in the last part of the nave, I tried to designate what seemed to me very good lessons that architects, designers, urbanists might find in that treasure trove of permaculture there. But I don't have time to go into that. I will just, this is another part that we added in Marseille, another series on regionalism and bioregionalism, which starts with the Iroquois people and ends with the Chiapas people, the Zapatistas in Chiapas. One of the things that fills me with hope today, I mean, the story of Chiapas in 1994, 1st January, when the ALENA, which treatise that was going to completely include South America and Mexico in particular into the liberal trade there, all of a sudden people saw an army of Indian, of Maya, armed, emerging from the forest, from the jungle, occupying 5 cities in the shouting "Ya basta," and since then they have managed to organize themselves. It's like the size of Belgium, basically, without money, developing educational, health system, government system, law system, entirely there. And they managed for 30 years to be still there, Okay, now I come to the conclusion. David Holmgren published in 2008 a little book called Future Scenarios, in which he does an exercise that I think is very enlightening. He's basically telling us we have not one problem, we have 2 problems. One, of course, we've heard a lot about it. It's like he calls it global warming, climate change. But you could add here biodiversity collapse, water scarcity, soil erosion. That I would describe more generally as the degradation of the conditions of life on our planet, which can be slow or rapid, benign or violent. You exactly don't know. But at the same time, we have another problem, which he calls oil decline. But you could add gas, coal, metals, rare earth, everything which is non-renewable, but which is absolutely essential to the power to transform the world around us, right? This also, this energy and material descent can be slow. So if you cross them, you obtain 4 quadrants, right? The first one, this one, the more benign, you still have a lot of power, and you're confronted to benign climate change, right? That he calls green tech. Oh, here, yeah, you can hope that you can develop industrially water turbine, wind turbines, solar concentration system, because you still have power and materials, right, to do that and to prepare for the moment, to decelerate the degradation or to attain a kind of steady state, dream of steady state. That's the best scenario, but maybe we're not there. Then there is another one up there where you still have power a lot, but you're confronted to very violent climate change and degradation. Then, says Holmgren, you can bet that we slowly get out of market economy and toward a convergence of very strong power states and big corporations, right? That are made possible by that power, which is harnessed, And so we are into China 2 or 3.0. We are in very dirigist states. We are in, it's basically in a way the definition of fascism by Mussolini, the convergence of very powerful states and a corporation, basically. So that's fascism. Then you have the opposite of that situation, which is here, which is the scenario that permaculture has been expecting, or preparing for, where you have benign degradation, but you have energy and material descent. And that's, for him, it will be the reverse condition compared to the Industrial Revolution. That will lead to people leaving the concentrated cities and to cultivate energy where it's still possible as living stuff. So people will leave the cities and maybe go into a new medieval period. And finally, there is the last one, here, which he calls lifeboats. So you don't get world wars. Because you cannot do world wars without very dense energy. But it's still a bit of Mad Max everywhere. That's the survivalist scenario. What David says is be careful. These scenarios are not exclusive from one another because some regions are diversely affected, right? And then even in the same region, they can be like Russian puppets within which, because it depends also of the number of people who are kind of aiming at that or that scenario. Even he says, he did this horrible drawing, but he says, even in one person, one couple, for instance, at the domestic level, they are going to be almost survivalist, no plastic, no recycling, systematic. At the collectivity, local community level, they're going to be involved, in the community, in the kind of permaculture stuff. Then they work maybe in a company that makes wind turbines, and when they vote, well, they choose kind of security, behind that. You know what I mean, We're all like that in a way. Anyway, so at the end of the exhibition, we played a kind of different game. It's not as logic of David, because I just wanted to distinguish 4 different kinds of narratives for the future, for the relationship between cities and countryside. The first one I called incorporation. That's Industrial Revolution 3.0. This is the narrative of the people who think that only a new industrial revolution will be able to solve the problems created by the preceding one, right? So a flight forward into technology. So this is how we drew it. Now, very concentrated cities. Of course, power, nuclear power, because they need super dense power to do that. Here you have the Hyperloop by Elon Musk, between things. So in that scenario, the cities become the control tower of all the territories, and all the agriculture. The agriculture is not anymore the business of farmer, it's a business of high-tech corporation, etc. Second scenario, kind of architect like the second one, generally, I call negotiation or integration. These are the guys who say, yes, the cities are going to continue to grow. It's inevitable. So it has to be made possible. So let's invent hybrid metropolises that will integrate agriculture, forestry as elements of its program. This is a kind of a broadacre city revisited today. It's Paola Vigano, the horizontal metropolis. You see this kind of stuff. You could call it, strictly speaking, more than urban agriculture. You should call it agricultural urbanism, right? It's a different way. Urban agriculture proper, I would call infiltration. It's the other way around. It's agricultural initiatives that permeates the cities, the existing cities, you know, the roofs, any place that is available, you make new commons. It's those citizens that, in a way, get a special relationship and direct relationship with background farmers, etc. So it's a kind of acupunctural stuff that can be encouraged by governments or by city-states, right? But it's infiltration. But it can be massive. If you think of Cuba and La Habana, during the special period, no more importations from the Soviets, it became the Mecca of permaculture. Unfortunately, it's not the case anymore, but it became really the most ecological country in the world for a number of years. Think of Detroit, the same, you know, collapse of the automobile industry, all of a sudden it's cultivated everywhere. And finally, a scenario which is completely the opposite of the first is, I call, secession. Secession is the narrative of many people, many permaculturists are in this stuff, other for very political activist reason, who say, well, the most important thing is, even if you are in the physical orbit of the metropolis, to become less and less dependent from the infrastructure, from the global governance, etc. And to try to reach at the local level, not complete self-sufficiency, but to go toward local, communal, community self-sufficiency, anarchist, basically. And this we summed up like this. So I'm done. I'm sorry, I had to rush. I will leave you with that question. What is a world, not the world? I have a provisional answer that I submit to your sagacity, which is a world is a territory, a region, a country, I don't know what scale, where one could reasonably imagine to project and spend one's entire existence. If you look at regions nowadays, asking you those questions, very, very few places you can actually do that. They are, most of them, unworldly in that sense. But maybe our task now is to actually become native to a place, right? As Wes Jackson said it. And that's, I think, a wonderful project for the Anthropocene. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. A better question from the students.
First of all, thank you for the talk. You mentioned the dialectic between the wizard and the prophet in light of the hyper-globalizing trends and concentration of today driven by economic factors. And
I'm sorry, I can't hear very well. I don't know why there is a sound. Maybe without the micro, if you speak loud, without the micro.
Or you come here.
Because it's all blurred.
Yeah.
You mentioned the dialectic between the wizard and the prophet in light of the hyper-globalizing trends and concentration of today driven by economic factors and through the urban experiments and proposals that have generated the most discussions, such as the line that you mentioned. So we seem to be fully embracing the wizard's vision and the potentially dystopian implications it represents. So in practical terms, is the prophet's message doomed to fall on deaf ears, or are there contemporary attempts for secession, as you mentioned, to recalibrate the situation?
Thank you for this question, because it allows me also to, in a way, complete what the thing I've concluded with. In the same way, so you're right, the wizards have taken the stage for now a number of decades, including in urbanism and in architecture. And is there a place left? You mentioned for the prophets. Of course, the four scenarios that I concluded with in our exhibition, the four stuff. We could say about them what David says about his scenarios, that they are not totally exclusive of one another. Actually, you can see them happening now, each of them, with more or less power, more or less effects or consequence, but incorporation is happening. Negotiation is happening big time. Infiltration has been happening for a time, and secession is also happening here or there. So they are happening at the same time, all of them. And they can more or less be combined. And the same remark that David does about his scenarios can be made about that, meaning, well, all regions of the world are not exactly exposed to the same situation. If you come to Singapore and say, why secession? How do they do? You know? In a way, they are bound for incorporation. You know, I mean, unless they completely, I don't know, do. Other regions are already, you could say, almost secessionists there. And in between, we have all those things. But it's true that they each embody a very different discourse and beliefs about the reason why we are in the mess where we are. So they are, in principle, some of them totally opposed, especially incorporation and secession, the other two less, you know. But they are happening at the same time. So I have no, how could I say? I actually explain in the exhibition. I think I try not to caricature them. Incorporation is an environmental narrative. You know, it's typically actually the guy who published the whole Earth catalog back in the 70s, Stuart Brand. 30 years later, who was the advocate of, you could say, secession. 30 years later, in 2008, he published a book called The Whole Earth Discipline, where he said, oh, I made a mistake. I made a mistake. Climate change is such a global problem that we only can devise global answers, right? Hence, he advocates for concentration now. Population problem, concentration. Concentrate people into cities and metropolises, they will make less kids. It's proven, even in slums, right? Problem of energy, nuclear. Concentrated waste, very dangerous, but concentrated, not diffuse like the others. Problem of food, GMOs. GMOs, because GMOs, you know, are predictable, unlike nature, who is deceitful, you know. And if that is not enough, geoengineering, you know, and Elon Musk, we go terraform Mars and stuff like that. So the thing is, prophets can only be heard when those promises of technology obviously fail. And I think they are obviously failing. No, I just say that as a, I don't know actually. what I'm trying to say myself. I explained where I would locate myself 3 years ago in my own windrows, very close to secession, with a leaning on infiltration, a kind of moderate tolerance for integration, and a complete diffidence for incorporation. This is how I would situate myself now. Might evolve.
Kind of all together, and also can we say that the infiltration is the more realistic scenario for us to applicate in the cities we have right now? Because the other one seems to me that are a bit more radical and far in the future.
Yeah. The infiltration is probably with secession, the one that requires the less, that doesn't make an incredible bet on the availability of resources. Incorporation and negotiation are quite resource intensive, both of them. The two others are on principle less resource intensive. And if you take seriously, as I do myself, but the warnings on what we call energy and material descent, which I understand that they are not completely convincing, right? Because after the peak of conventional oil, we had, you name it, oil shale, tar sands, and everything. But it very much looks like I look very seriously at these questions now. It kind of looks as if they are picking themselves, those non-conventional resources now. Of course, we have now the Alaska being mined, the Greenland, the all things that are opened by the melting of the pole. Okay, so we'll see. We'll see. So on the one hand, we can think that sooner or later, it's going to be really the descent. It's already a descent in net energy, for instance. You know that the evolution of the mining of energy, of fossil energy, has been toward smaller and smaller energy return, right? So you obtain less usable net energy, even though you produce more energy, of which a bigger and bigger part is used to mine the new energy. So we are already into a descent of net energy, but we are still into growth, moderate growth of energy brut, gross energy. But I'm confident myself that soon, and the Club of Rome scenario will just happen as they described 50 years ago. I just read again, tired of reading critics of the Club of Rome of 72, by radical ecologists who say, yeah, but these were scientists, the MIT, system thinking, and all that we hate. I reread the first, because they did two others 30 years after. The first Limits to Growth report in 72. It's just amazing, because you think it was published yesterday. Yesterday. They are totally right. I mean, and yet there is an Australian guy who did a kind of who did a kind of review. It was 10 years ago already, looking at their first scenario, business as usual, and measuring, where the world is now, where it was now 40 years after then. And he said, well, basically, you have their curve, and you have the curve that goes like that, but it's exactly the line. And remember, they said, this business as usual scenario said, Well, according to our model, they said, between the first third and the first half of the 21st century, there will be a global economic collapse, but collapse, not just not even the 30s, the crisis of the 30s, a collapse. Of course, they were making no geopolitical stuff. They just look at globally the thing. So probably, you know, some people will manage, I don't know, some regions of the world, etc. But basically, it's exactly their scenario happening. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In that they have to be considered, and maybe the only way to survive is to synchronize together agricultural architecture. So I want to ask you, what are the steps that we can take as an individual without kind of fighting it to bridge the gap between them? I mean, without fighting, I mean, okay, without lifestyle, but I think it's a bit kind of cycling.
It's a bit what? One first answer would be, I don't know, which would be largely true. And then the second one would be actually many different offers are on the table. One step, for instance, is to do a 72 hours program with permaculturists. Just to get to know, you know, what the soil is, how you can, you know, do all those stuff, or do a formation in agroecology here or there. What I do think is that by doing this, you not only you become more aware of the importance of being able to at least control a bit better what you do and where you get your basic resources from, but also that you become a bit more intelligent, more globally. This is why we put such an emphasis in the exhibition on permaculture, because it kind of articulated already almost 50 years ago, also it's 78, it articulated a theory of design, of project, you know, applied to managing resilient, productive gardens. That is one of the most convincing theory of design ever produced in front of the big issues that we have. Of course, at the domestic and, let's say, local collective scale, which is why a lot of people make this reproach, but permaculture is not going to feed the world, you know. I don't buy it. And it's normal that they don't buy it, because permaculture is not for sale. It's not a series of recipes that you could blow at a large scale, just like that. It's all about managing locally, you know, taking into account the specifics of the place. It's a casuistic discipline. Each case is different, you know, and has to be dealt with locally. But beside that, there are still principles, ethical and design principles, that are extremely refined, and in my view, more relevant than any theory, so-called theory of architecture that has been produced in the last 50 years.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Great. So Professor Marot, to my knowledge, so it's especially just to the PhD students who will have the opportunity to pose more questions and engage a close dialogue. But if some of you want to join, it's also possible to do it. So in case some of the other students wish to join, just drop me an email so that we know the top number of people. But it's open to those who wish to attend. Thanks a lot.
Right, thanks.
Case for election. In the library, we have obviously the catalog of the Lisbon exhibition. Although this website is incredibly well done and
Open source.
open source, and you can
All the content of the exhibition is there.
We also have the countryside exhibition by Paulus. The book was not called countryside.
The future.
The future, but the report. So that is the book of the exhibition. And then there's plenty of other things that he has mentioned that are in the library. So if you want to go deep in the field. Thank you.
Okay, ciao.
Sorry, and go in Venice with the students. But if you agree, I can come there and meet you.
Sure, sure. Of course. Okay. Good luck with that. The what? Yeah, yeah. The trip, yeah, it was 2 hours late, but
Okay.
that's like, yeah.
Not the bad way.
No, first. No. So you are Lausanne. Ah, okay.
I'm the responsible.
Fine, thank you then for all your help.
And then the website is amazing. All the poster are really interesting.
It's just the feeling that you could right.
Yes.
And questo c'era un letter. No,